Okay, so today I'm going to make a video of a lesson that I would normally have you do on your own for homework. So this is a text that I like my students to read when we start reading The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, because it is a little bit of important history and background information about the experience of Native Americans historically in our country. It gives you a little bit of context, which is always super important when you're reading a book. Okay, so this book is from this video, this video about a reading is from a chapter from a book, and it's called A Brief History of American Indians. Skip that. So let's just read through this together. American Indian ways of learning. For over 15,000 years, the indigenous people of North America thrived in tribal communities with respect for the land, plant, and animal life and their languages. Children were educated within their homes and families. Parents and grandparents taught young people through everyday life activities and special times of learning, such as storytelling and ceremonies. That paragraph is reminding us that there's more than one way to learn and that school or education doesn't have to just look like the way we do it most places in the United States. There are different ways to learn all over the world. And we studied some of this when we thought about the way people have lived all the way back into the earliest of human times. It hasn't always looked the way it does today. American Indians developed a vast skill set that enabled them to thrive in both work and leisure time. They discovered medicines for a wide array of physical ailments such as stomach aches, joint and muscle pain, for example, aspirin and wintergreen. Native Americans discovered those things as medicines in nature long, long time ago. And arthritis. As agriculturalists, they developed such techniques as irrigation, soil enrichment, and terrace farming. As architects, American Indians engineered efficient housing structures, the longhouse, the wigwam, and pueblos, not to mention the Great Pyramids of Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, and other parts of there. In an intricately woven structure, they lived in multi-generational homes where they revered both immediate and extended families, clan families. Storytelling, dance, religious ceremonies, and harvest feasts were long enjoyed traditions. So that's just a little 2 paragraphs about sort of basic generalizations. Now we move into the period of conquest and colonization from 1492, which, as you know, marks Columbus visiting this continent. The Europeans' quest for more land and wealth led to the colonization of countries along the coasts of Africa, India, and North America. Spain invaded North America, known to the Indians as Turtle Island, through Central America, moving northward, while the English and French began to colonize the East Coast, expanding westward. Some of the Europeans sought respectful trade relations. However, some sought to enslave American Indians and claim the land for themselves. As more people came to the New World, is what they called it, the demand for land and resources increased. European immigrants that migrated to America wanted land. However, the land was already inhabited by millions of American Indians. We learned about this on Thursday. There were already many, many people living here in their own societies, in their own cities, in their own tribal structures. The concept of manifest destiny, that's a word you hear in social studies a lot. Manifest destiny is this idea that early settlers believed in their right and their duty to claim land across this new world. Any measures required to accomplish this process were seen as necessary and just, even if it meant taking the lives and the land of Native Americans. As a result, millions of American Indians were killed in a short span of time. Only 2.5% of the original population remained after 1900, which, if you remember on Thursday, we did talk about that, which we know is technically is called genocide. Reservations, removal, and resistance. By the end of the 19th century, American Indians, once stewards of the earth, which means caretakers of the earth, were now confined to living on small parcels of unproductive land called reservations. The United States government, right, perceived Indian problem was addressed through federal policies and acts of violence. American Indian clothing, spirituality, and hairstyles were just a few of the things that were considered, quote, savage and declared illegal by the United States government. Some people, such as the Puritans, protested and the systematic destruction of American Indians, but their voice was a small one and it went unheard. So, through this idea of ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own race is superior to others, through manifest destiny and through colonization, basically the greed for land and resources, Native American people's way of life was outlawed. It was considered illegal so that the white European settlers could feel justified in taking land and resources away from these people and pushing them off of their land. So that is important to understand. And that's where that term savage comes again, which is basically used in legal documents to make excuses for taking away culture, language, land, resources, and murdering people by the government. The threats to American Indians came in many forms: wars, forced relocations. For example, maybe you've heard of the Trail of Tears. Foreign diseases. You may be aware that smallpox, scarlet fever, things that Europeans had developed an immunity to, Native Americans did not have an immunity to those things. And so the Europeans brought those diseases in their bodies, and they survived if they had those germs in their bodies, but the Native people did not when they were exposed to it. These threats brought an unprecedented and extreme level of destruction to American Indian people. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, most racist and hateful president against Native Americans of all of them. It marks the beginning of many forced relocations. These resulted in an enormous loss of life, land, and resources. American Indians were forced to move west, one step ahead of the white man's advanced weapons, increasing population, and ethnocentrism, or belief that they were the only ones who mattered. Strong military forces were frequently used against American Indians. The United States government also paid citizens for the scalps of American Indian men, women, and children. I want you to pay attention to this because this is a myth that we need to erase. In California alone, over $250,000 in scalped bounties were paid out for killing American Indians. Ironically, this new country was founded on the belief of life, liberty, and justice for all, but that did not include many, many people of color. So there is a myth that Native Americans scalped settlers, took their heads and cut the tops of their heads off as a war prize. And in reality, that was the opposite of what really did happen, which was that white people were given money for every scalp or every, the skin, the top of a head of a dead Native American person that they brought in, because the goal was to completely eradicate, completely wipe out the population of Native people. American progress. In South Dakota in the winter of 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee ironically was recorded as one of the last Indian wars. The ravaged American Indians were forced into a small encampment. They were forbidden to sing traditional songs and practice their religion. In an attempt to bring strength and healing to their community, Lakota leaders began a spirit dance called the Ghost Dance. The federal government response was quick and violent, so their religion was outlawed. Again, this was the reason many European settlers, colonists, came to this country in the first place, if you remember, we're learning about that, leaving England because of religious persecution. And so many of these, years later, the people running the new United States government outlawed other people's religion. In less than 4 hours, military troops surrounded the camp and positioned 4 rapid-fire cannons. I'm going to skip this part. Basically, they killed over 3 women and children. And there is a monument at Wounded Knee that you can go to. I've been there a couple of times to see it, memorializing this massacre. Throughout this era, the United States government coerced tribes into signing treaties. So we could talk a lot about how that happened, but oftentimes the treaties were written in English, and the leaders of the tribes didn't speak English or understand English, and so they were lied to. They were told that something was in the treaty that wasn't. They signed it, and then they got completely cheated out of what they thought they were signing. Vast amounts of American Indian land was unfairly traded for promises of money, food, and formal education and medicine that was for diseases brought by Europeans in the first place. American Indians were told they would be safer living away from white settlers. That's how they decided. That's how they kind of encouraged them to go live on what we call reservations. Small parcels of land called reservations were designated for Native American tribes. Due to the loss of their hunting and fishing grounds, American Indians were now forced to rely on the United States government for food. The government did not allow Native Americans to own private land until the General Allotment Act of 1887. This act divided reservations into individual homesteads. I'm going to skip this part. They were allowed to own land as long as they did not engage in any Indian activities like speaking their own language or practicing their own religions. It was the only way you would be allowed to legally own land. American Indians were allowed to become American citizens if they adopted the habits of civilized life, in quotation marks, meaning that they needed to completely assimilate or adopt white people's ways of living, including language, dress, education, culture, way of life. They had to give up who they were. Can you imagine? The Board of Indian Commissioners wrote that Christianity would quickly, humanely, and permanently solve the Indian problem. Religion was used to destroy Native culture. In the 1869 report, it said that the religion of our blessed Savior is the most effective agent for civilizing people. As if people living here weren't already civilized. Again, that is a use of language to manipulate who gets to decide how we define what other people are worth. Full citizenship was not granted to American Indians until 1924. So we're going to get into this now. Today, the reading for today is talking about what happens to Junior and how it connects his experience in the year 2000 is connected to what his ancestors went through in the 1800s all the way up until 1970. There were still Indian boarding schools open. So we're going to read a little bit about that. "Kill the Indian, save the man" was a quote that was used over and over and over again as a justification for boarding schools. Indian schools were designed to destroy American Indian cultures, language, and spirituality. Students had to accept white culture, the English and Christianity. The first and most well-known of these schools was the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. It was established in 1879 in Pennsylvania. Pratt conducted a social experiment with Apache prisoners of war. Their hair was cut, they were put in uniforms, forced to learn English, and during the course of this experiment, some were severely traumatized and many committed suicide. Some prisoners survived and learned to adapt to white people's ways. So that model was used to promote education, which I would put education in quotation marks because it really wasn't about education at all. It was about brainwashing for Indian children across the country. In 1900, by the year 1900, most American Indian children were taken away from their families. They were transported by train and then bus to boarding schools where they would be put into uniforms, have their hair cut, and be forced to act and speak like white people. Many spent their entire childhood in the American Indian boarding school system without seeing their parents. They were kept away from their parents because they knew if they went home, what would they do? They would speak their tribal language. They would eat their tribal foods. They would practice the way of life of their family. So they were kept away from their families. Upon graduating, these young American Indians still retained certain aspects of their culture, but they acted, spoke, and thought like English-speaking white Americans. They would return to their families and communities feeling like outcasts, and in most cases, their families and communities couldn't relate to them. No matter how much time and money and effort was made to assimilate American Indians, white society still did not accept them. No longer finding an identity in either white or tribal societies, Thousands of American Indian adolescents were thrust into an abyss of lost identity. So, let me stop this recording. Oh my gosh. How do you make it stop?